The air in the penthouse ballroom was thick with the smell of money. It was a sweet, heavy mix of expensive perfume, the waxy scent of hundreds of burning candles, and the faint, clean aroma of the orchids that spilled from every corner. Below, the city was a river of diamonds, but up here, in the private domain of Vance Sterling, it was just a backdrop. The real show was inside. It was his party, his annual spectacle. Everyone who was anyone, or who wanted to be someone, was there. Women in dresses that cost more than most cars glittered under the crystal chandeliers. Men in perfectly tailored suits talked in low, important voices about deals and markets. Waiters moved like silent ghosts through the crowd, holding trays of champagne flutes that never seemed to empty. Laughter rang out, sharp and bright, but it never quite reached the eyes. It was a beautiful, boring puzzle, and Vance was tired of it. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a half-empty glass of something amber in his hand. He was a man who had everything, and tonight, like most nights, it all felt like nothing. The conversations were the same. The smiles were fake. The whole night was as predictable as a spreadsheet. His eyes scanned the room and landed on the one thing that was supposed to be different, the piano. It was a magnificent concert grand, a beast of polished black lacquer that sat like a sleeping panther on a raised platform. He'd bought it on a whim, told his designer to make it the centerpiece. He'd imagined it would add class, maybe spark some interesting moments. But all night, it had just sat there, untouched, another pretty decoration. The thought annoyed him. All that potential, just silent. A man in a suit that was almost as expensive as Vance's own sidled up to him, laughing too loudly at something that wasn't that funny. Incredible party, Vance, simply incredible. Vance gave a slow smile that didn't warm his face. It's missing something, don't you think? Missing. It's perfect. Music, Vance said, his voice cutting through the man's enthusiasm. Real music. Not this. He gestured vaguely at the soft, inoffensive jazz coming from hidden speakers. He pushed off from the window and walked toward the piano. A few people noticed, their conversations dipping. When Vance Sterling moved, people watched. He climbed the 2 shallow steps to the platform and ran a finger along the sleek, cool lid of the piano. A hush began to spread, rippling out from him. He turned to face his guests, that same cool smile on his lips. His voice, amplified by the sudden quiet, was clear and edged with a challenge. This, he announced, patting the piano, cost more than your house. And all it's done tonight is look pretty. That seems like a waste. A few polite chuckles. People weren't sure where this was going, but they were ready to be entertained. I look around, Vance continued, swirling the ice in his glass, and I see a room full of the most accomplished, brilliant people in the city. CEOs, investors, heirs, people who make things happen. He paused, letting the flattery sink in. Then his tone shifted, just a little, into something darker, more playful. But I wonder, with all this success, has anyone kept room for a soul? The laughter this time was more nervous. He had their full attention now. See this? He pointed to the sheet music open on the stand. It was complicated, a dense forest of black notes. Rachmaninoff, Second Piano Concerto. Not the easy bit at the beginning, but the big, stormy part from the first movement. It's not just notes, it's feeling. It's heartbreak and fury and life. The stuff that happens before you can afford to hide from it. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw curiosity, confusion, and in some of the younger, braver faces, a flicker of excitement. So here's my challenge, he said, and his voice dropped, becoming almost intimate, though everyone could hear. Come up here, play this, actually play it. Don't just tap the keys. Make us feel it. Play it with everything you've got. A mischievous, reckless glint entered his eyes. It was the look of a very rich, very bored man about to light a very expensive fire for fun. Do that, play it perfectly, and on a whim, as a prize for reminding me what real passion looks like. I'll marry you. For a second, there was dead silence. Then the room exploded. It wasn't a roar of outrage, but of delighted, disbelieving laughter. It was the most outrageous, ridiculous, thrilling thing they'd ever heard. It was a billionaire's joke, a piece of theater. They all knew it. He wasn't serious. How could he be? But the possibility, the sheer insanity of it, was electric. A young woman, a socialite known more for her wardrobe than her wisdom, was the first to stumble up, giggling. For you, Vance. Anything? She plonked herself down and hit a few clumsy chords. The sound was jarring and wrong. She laughed harder, gave up, and blew him a kiss as she staggered back to her friends, who shrieked with laughter. that broke the seal. A hedge fund manager, who bragged about his childhood lessons, tried next. He managed a few correct measures, but his playing was stiff, mechanical, like he was typing an email. There was no music in it, only memory. He flushed and retreated to a smatter of unkind applause. Each attempt fed the party's energy. It became the main event. A well-known composer's son gave it a go. His technique solid, but his interpretation shallow. A tech whiz kid approached it like a coding problem. All precision and no pulse. Each failure made the challenge seem more impossible, more mythical, and the laughter grew louder, less generous. The guests weren't just watching people fail to play piano. They were watching people humiliate themselves for a billionaire's amusement, and they loved it. Vance watched from his perch, sipping his drink. The joke was starting to taste a bit sour. The mockery in the room was becoming mean, and the piano, his beautiful, silent piano, was being turned into a joke. He was about to raise his hand, to call the whole thing off and have the instrument covered, when his eye caught a movement at the very edge of the light, near a service door. Partially hidden by a huge arrangement of flowers, was a man in dark gray work pants and a simple polo shirt with a small building logo on the chest. A janitor. He was standing perfectly still, one hand resting on the handle of his cleaning cart, which held a bucket and mops. His eyes were not on the laughing crowd, nor on the failed pianists. They were fixed on the keyboard. On his face was a look Vance couldn't quite place. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't judgment. It was something deeper, older, a kind of quiet recognition, and a profound, aching sadness. The janitor's hands, resting on the cart, were large and strong-looking, with long fingers. As Vance watched, hidden by the crowd, he saw those fingers flex slightly, curling into a loose fist and then stretching out, as if they were remembering something. Another crash of wrong notes from the piano, followed by a roar of laughter, snapped Vance's attention back. The current volunteer, a man now bright red, slunk away. "All right, I think we've seen enough," Vance began, his voice loud, ready to end his own game, but a voice, soft but firm, cut through the dying laughter. It came from the shadows by the flowers. "I will try." The crowd, following Vance's gaze, turned as one. A wave of confusion, then utter disbelief, passed over them. A janitor? Was this part of the act? A paid comedian in a costume? People stepped aside, creating a narrow path from the service door to the piano. The janitor didn't look at any of them. He pushed his cart neatly against the wall, wiped his hands once, almost unconsciously, on the sides of his pants, and walked forward. His work boots were quiet but solid on the polished floor. The sea of silk and tuxedos parted for him, their expressions a mix of shock and cruel anticipation. This would be the funniest one yet. He reached the steps and climbed them to stand beside Vance, who was staring at him, completely thrown. The janitor didn't ask for permission. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Up close, Vance could see the lines on his face, the weariness around his eyes, but also a strange calm. A snicker came from the crowd. Someone whispered, "Is he going to play with his mop?" Vance recovered, his billionaire's mask sliding back into place. This was unexpected, but the show must go on. He made a grand, sweeping gesture toward the piano bench. "The floor waxer wants a shot at my fortune," he said, his voice dripping with amused condescension. "By all means, maestro, entertain us." The janitor, a man named Elias, sat down. The bench was still warm from the last person. He adjusted it slightly, a small, professional movement. He looked at the sheet music, his eyes scanning the complex lines for only a second before he closed them. He didn't need it. He placed his feet on the pedals. He lifted his large, work-worn hands, the fingers with their rough skin and short, practical nails, and held them poised above the pristine ivory keys. The room was utterly silent now. This was the quiet before the biggest laugh of the night. They waited for the first ugly, discordant note, the punchline to the joke. Elias took a slow, deep breath and let his hands fall. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a heavy, waiting kind of quiet, like the air before a lightning strike. All eyes were locked on the janitor's hands, those big, practical hands with their short nails and the faint, permanent lines of grime no soap could quite lift. They hovered above the keys, and the crowd held its breath, ready to explode into laughter at the first wrong note. He didn't play immediately. He just sat there, his back straight but not stiff, his head slightly bowed. He wasn't looking at the keys or the people. His eyes were closed, as if he was listening to a song only he could hear. For a long, painful second, nothing happened. Someone in the back stifled a giggle then. His right hand moved. Not a dramatic flourish, but a simple, deliberate descent. A single note rang out deep, clear, and resonant. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling. It vibrated in the chests of the people in the front row. It hung in the air, full and ripe, before it began to fade, before it could disappear. His left hand joined. A chord, rich and complex, bloomed beneath that first note. And then, the music began. It wasn't the timid, stumbling start everyone expected. It wasn't a struggle. It was a sudden, confident cascade of sound, like a dam had broken inside the piano. His fingers, which moments ago had been pushing a mop bucket, now flew across the keyboard with a power and a grace that seemed impossible. The difficult, stormy passage from the Rachmaninoff concerto unfolded, not as a series of notes to be conquered, but as a story to be told. The first wave of shock hit the crowd physically. The smirks froze, then melted away. The amused glint in Vance Sterling's eyes vanished, replaced by pure, uncomprehending astonishment. His glass, halfway to his lips, stopped moving. This was not correct playing. This was something else entirely. The janitor's body moved with the music. It wasn't a showy performance. It was a conversation. His shoulders rose and fell. He leaned into the fierce, pounding bass notes, making the floor tremble. Then he would pull back, his right hand drawing out a melody so tender and lonely it made the heart ache. The music swelled with anger, then collapsed into sorrow. It was furious one moment, pleading the next. A woman near the front, who had laughed the loudest at the socialite's attempt, felt her eyes prickle with heat. She wasn't thinking about the joke anymore. She was thinking about a loss she'd buried years ago. The memory suddenly sharp and clear. A tough-looking businessman stared at the floor, his jaw tight, seeing not a janitor, but the ghost of a dream he'd given up for practical reasons. Vance was transfixed. He knew this piece. He'd heard it performed by famous musicians in concert halls. It had always been impressive, a display of skill. But this was raw. It was untamed. It felt dangerous and true. He watched the janitor's face. His eyes were open now, fixed on some distant point beyond the wall, seeing something or someone the music was painting in the air. There was no pride there, no pleasure in the crowd's stunned reaction. There was only a deep, consuming sadness and a kind of release. The technical perfection was beyond question. The speed, the accuracy, the control of dynamics from a whisper to a roar were flawless. But it was the emotion that held the room hostage. Every note was soaked in feeling. You could hear the struggle in the crashing chords, the longing in the sighing melodies. This wasn't a man playing a billionaire's challenge. This was a man emptying his soul into a box of wood and wire. As the piece built towards its most famous, heartbreaking theme, something changed in the room. The collective shock softened into something closer to reverence. People weren't just listening. They were feeling. They were remembering. A waiter, frozen in place with a tray of empty flutes, thought of his mother back home, 1,000 miles away. A young heiress, bored all night, felt a sudden, confusing surge of her own insignificance, and a greater, more confusing desire to be real. Then came the theme. It poured out of the piano, that gorgeous, sweeping melody of love and loss. It was so beautiful it was almost painful to hear. The janitor played it with a simplicity that shattered any remaining distance. He wasn't showing off. He was confessing. That's when Vance saw it. A single, clear tear escaped from the corner of the janitor's eye. It traced a path through the fine dust on his cheek, a clean line on a weathered face. It fell, sparkling for a split second in the chandelier light, onto the back of his work-roughened hand as it flew over the keys. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't even seem to notice. He just kept playing, pouring more of himself into the music. The tear did something to the crowd. It broke the last barrier. A few people in the audience now had tears on their own cheeks, not even knowing why. The silence between the phrases of music was filled not with judgment, but with a shared, breathless intensity. The final minutes of the piece were a torrent, a storm of sound that seemed to shake the very glass in the windows. The janitor's whole body was engaged, driving the music forward with a desperate, final energy. And then, with a series of powerful, decisive chords, it ended, not with a timid fade, but with a statement that echoed in the sudden, absolute quiet. His hands dropped to his lap. The last vibration of the final note hummed in the air and slowly died away. No one clapped. No one moved. The sound of the music had been so huge that the silence afterward felt like a physical presence, thick and sacred. The janitor sat still, head bowed again, his breathing the only slight movement. He looked drained, as if he'd just run a marathon in a minute. Vance was the first to break the spell. He took a step forward, the movement clumsy. The ice in his forgotten glass clinked softly, a tiny, ridiculous sound in the vast quiet. He looked at the janitor, then at the piano, then back at the janitor. The arrogant billionaire was completely gone. In his place was a man who had just had the foundations of his world rocked. He opened his mouth, but his voice, when it came, was rough, barely above a whisper. It wasn't the voice he used for boardrooms or television. "Who?" he started, then cleared his throat. "Who are you?" The janitor took a slow breath and lifted his head. He looked at Vance, and for the first time, there was a direct connection. His eyes were tired, red-rimmed, but clear. "Just the man who cleans the floors," he said, his voice low and gravelly from disuse, yet calm. "That's not true," Vance said, and it wasn't an accusation. It was a plea for understanding. No one plays like that. Not without a story." The janitor gave a small, weary smile that didn't reach his eyes. He placed a hand gently on the side of the piano, a touch that was almost a goodbye. He stood up from the bench. The movement seemed to release the room from its freeze, and then the sound came. It wasn't the polite, practiced applause from earlier in the night. It started from one place, from the waiter with the tray. He put his tray down on a table, carefully, and began to clap. Slow, firm claps. Then the businessman next to him joined. Then the woman who had cried. It spread like a wave, gaining speed and strength until the entire ballroom was thunderous with it. People were on their feet, their faces alight with awe, with gratitude, with the shock of having witnessed something miraculous. They weren't applauding a one-bet. They were applauding the truth they had just heard. The janitor flinched slightly at the roar of noise, as if it were too bright a light. He gave one last, short nod, not to the crowd, but to the piano itself. Then he turned and walked back down the steps. The crowd parted for him again, but this time the looks were different. There was respect, wonder, even a touch of shame. He walked straight past the cleaning cart, through the service door, and was gone. But the applause didn't stop. It went on and on, filling the space he had left behind. Vance stood alone on the platform, the roaring crowd in front of him, the silent, magnificent piano beside him. He looked at the door through which the man had disappeared. The joke was over. The game was done. And for the first time in a very long time, Vance Sterling had absolutely no idea what to do next. The echo of the music, and the memory of that single tear, were louder in his head than the cheers of 1,000 people. The applause finally died down, leaving a strange, buzzing energy in the ballroom. The party was over, but nobody left. They stood in small, hushed groups, talking in low, excited voices. All the conversations were about one thing: the music. The janitor. The billionaire's face when he heard it. Smartphones were pulled out. Videos were compared. Already, the magic was being turned into digital bits to be shared. But Vance Sterling didn't notice any of it. He stood by the piano for a long moment after the janitor left, his hand resting on the cool wood where the man's hands had just been. The keys seemed to hum, holding the ghost of the sound. He finally turned and, without a word to any of his stunned guests, walked off the platform. His steps weren't the confident stride of the host. They were slow, purposeful, like a man following a trail. He went straight to the service door. Pushing through it was like entering another world. The thick carpet and perfumed air were gone, replaced by the faint smell of disinfectant and concrete. The lush lighting turned into the flat, bright glare of fluorescent tubes. The sounds of the party became a distant murmur. He was in a plain, white hallway lined with industrial shelves holding cases of wine and spare linens. A young busboy, carrying a tray of discarded glasses, almost walked into him. The boy's eyes went wide with panic. "Mr. Sterling." "Sir, I'm so sorry. You can't. I mean, this area is... Where does the night crew go?" Vance asked. His voice was quiet, but it filled the hallway. The break room, sir. Down the hall, to the left." Vance nodded and walked past him. The break room was a small, utilitarian space with a scarred table, some chairs, and an old coffee machine. It was empty except for one person. The janitor was sitting at the table, his hands wrapped around a plain white mug. He had taken off his work polo shirt, revealing a simple gray t-shirt underneath. He was just sitting there, staring at the wall, looking more tired than any man Vance had ever seen. He didn't look up when Vance entered. Vance stood in the doorway for a moment. He'd rehearsed a dozen things to say in his head on the walk over. Grand offers, demands for an explanation. Now, in this quiet, sad room, None of them felt right. He pulled out a chair opposite the man. The metal legs scraped loudly on the floor. The janitor finally looked at him. There was no surprise in his eyes, just that same deep exhaustion. "You asked me who I was," the janitor said, his voice a low rumble. "I told you. You told me your job." Vance corrected him gently. "That's not who you are. Not after what I just heard. Please." The janitor took a slow sip from his mug. He was silent for so long Vance thought he wouldn't answer. He looked past Vance, at nothing the long time ago. He began, the words coming out slowly, like they were heavy to lift. "I was someone else. I played, that's all I did. From the time I was a boy, it was the only thing that made sense to me. The piano wasn't an instrument. It was my voice." He paused, his fingers tracing a chip on the mug. "I played everywhere. Concert halls. Big, beautiful places, just like your ballroom. People came to listen. They called me. Promising. They said I had a brilliant future." He fell silent again. The coffee machine gurgled in the corner. "What happened?" Vance asked. He wasn't the billionaire now. He was just a man listening to a story. "Life happened," the janitor said with a small, sad shrug. "My wife, she was. My melody, she understood the music. She was the reason it had joy." His throat worked for a moment. "She got sick. It was a long sickness. The doctors, the treatments. It took everything. Not just money, time, energy, hope." "I canceled tours. I stopped practicing. I sat by her bed and held her hand. The only music was the quiet sound of her breathing." He looked down into his coffee. "When she died, the music in me died too. Or I thought it did. The piano wasn't my voice anymore. It was a scream I couldn't bear to let out. It was a room full of memories of her, listening. I couldn't touch it. I sold mine. I walked away from all of it. The contracts, the agents, the audiences. It was just noise. I needed quiet. I needed work that didn't ask me to feel anything. So I cleaned. I fixed things. I made messes disappear." It was peaceful. Vance couldn't speak. He just looked at the man's hands, those powerful, graceful hands now resting still around a cheap mug. "Tonight," the janitor continued, "I heard your challenge. I heard all those people trying and failing to find the heart in that piece. They were playing notes. She loved that piece. She said it sounded like a love story written in a thunderstorm." A single tear, a twin to the one on stage, escaped and rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "I hadn't touched a piano in over 15 years. But sitting there, with everyone laughing, it wasn't about your joke. It wasn't about you. It was for her. I just wanted to hear it again, for her. One last time." The raw honesty of it hit Vance like a punch. His whole silly, cynical game, the marriage joke, the mockery had been brushed aside by this man's immense, private grief. Vance had been playing a game. This man had been attending a funeral. "I am so sorry," Vance said. The words felt useless, but they were the only true ones he had. "For the spectacle. I had no idea." The janitor finally looked at him directly. "You don't have to be sorry. You gave me a reason to play it for her again. In a strange way. Thank you." That thank you shamed Vance more than any anger could have done. Just then, a noise came from the hallway. The building's night manager, a nervous man in a suit, peered in. "Mr. Sterling." "Sir, there are people, reporters, they're downstairs. Someone posted a video. It's everywhere." Vance had completely forgotten about the outside world. He looked back at the janitor, who just looked resigned, like a storm he'd been waiting for had finally arrived. "I'll handle it," Vance said, standing up. It wasn't a command. It was a promise. "What's your name?" the janitor told him. It was a simple, solid name. Vance repeated it, committing it to memory. "Okay, stay here. Finish your coffee. I'll be back." Out in the ballroom, the scene had changed. The party guests were still there, but now they were mixed with camera crews and journalists who had somehow rushed over. Phones were thrust toward Vance. A dozen voices shouted questions at once. "Mr. Sterling, is it true a janitor won your marriage challenge? Who is the mystery pianist? Are you actually going to marry him? Was this a publicity stunt?" Vance walked to the spot where he'd made his foolish challenge. He didn't need to call for quiet this time. The room fell silent instantly, cameras clicking. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces. He saw the greed for a story, the hunger for a scandal. He thought of the man in the break room, and the tear on his cheek. He took a deep breath. "Earlier tonight," he began, his voice clear and strong, "I made a joke. A stupid, arrogant joke. I treated something beautiful, music, real human emotion, like a party trick. I mocked it. And I encouraged all of you, he said, sweeping his gaze across the crowd, to mock it with me. A few people had the decency to look at their feet. A man who works in this building, a man who keeps it clean for all of us, showed me what a fool I was. He didn't play for a prize. He didn't play for fame. He played for a memory. He played with a truth and a heart that my money could never buy. Vance paused, letting his words sink in. So, to answer your questions, no, this was not a stunt. It was my mistake. And no, there will be no marriage. That was the joke part. The only real thing here tonight was his music. He could see the reporters' faces fall a little. The sensational story was slipping away. From now on, Vance continued, a new idea forming as he spoke. The story isn't about my stupid challenge. The story is about him, and about what real talent looks like when it's not on a stage. He looked directly into the nearest camera. And I'm going to make sure that story is heard the right way. He stepped away, ignoring the fresh wave of shouted questions. He signaled to his head of security, clear the room, please. The party is over. And find out which guest posted the first video. Then he turned and went back to the service hallway, back to the quiet break room, to the man with the sad eyes and the magical hands. He had a lot more to learn, and an apology that needed to be paid in actions, not just words. The game was truly over. Now, the real work was about to begin. The next week was a storm of noise, and Vance Sterling stood in the center of it. But for the first time, the noise wasn't about him. It was about the janitor. The video, shaky and poorly lit, had done exactly what everyone knew it would do. It went everywhere. News shows played the clip. The internet was obsessed. The billionaire's janitor was the only story anyone wanted to talk about. Vance watched it all from his office, a silent command center high above the city. His staff brought him reports. Offers were pouring in, not to him, but to the man now famous as the janitor maestro. Talent agents, reality TV producers, talk show hosts, recording companies, they all wanted a piece. They smelled a Cinderella story, a viral sensation they could package and sell. One particularly sleazy producer even pitched a show called Mop to Maestro, which made Vance push his whole keyboard off his desk in disgust. He didn't forward any of it. He had people quietly find out where the janitor lived, a small, tidy apartment in a quiet, older part of the city, and he made sure no reporters could get close. He paid for a discreet security detail, not to imprison the man, but to give him a wall of silence. The janitor, whose name was Leo, had gone back to work. He'd called his supervisor, a confused man who'd seen the video, and simply said, "I'll be in for my shift tonight," and he was. He cleaned offices, emptied trash, and buffed floors, all while the world screamed his name outside. Vance knew he had to see him again. He couldn't just hide him. He had to make things right. And the vague idea he'd had in the ballroom was now a solid plan in his heart. He didn't call. He drove himself, in a simple car, to Leo's apartment building on a rainy Thursday evening. He found Leo in the building's tiny basement laundry room, folding towels. The sight was so normal, so deeply human, it stopped Vance in the doorway. Leo looked up, saw him, and didn't seem surprised. He just nodded toward a folding chair. "You can sit, if you don't mind the smell of dryer sheets." Vance sat. For a minute, they just listened to the rumble of the machines. "Thank you," Vance said finally, "for the security. They haven't found me. I didn't do it for thanks," Vance said. "I did it because it was my mess. I started that circus." Leo finished folding a towel, his movements precise. "You didn't make me play, no, but I made a shrine out of your private grief, and I'm sorry for that." Vance leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "They're all calling. Every vulture with a checkbook. They want to make you a star again." A shadow passed over Leo's face. "I don't want to be a star. I told you that life is a ghost." "I know," Vance said quickly, "and I'm not here to bring the ghost back. I'm here to build something new from it." He took a deep breath. "That night, you said playing reminded you of your wife, that she was your melody. What if her melody didn't have to end?" Leo looked at him, his eyes guarded. "For 15 years, you've been cleaning up other people's messes," Vance said, his words careful. "What if you could help clean up a different kind of mess? A mess of silence." He pulled a simple folder from his jacket and laid it on the dryer between them. "I want to start a foundation, a music foundation, not for prodigies to win competitions, for kids in neighborhoods where music programs were the first thing cut from the budget, for schools with broken pianos and no one to fix them, For teenagers who have a storm inside them and no instrument to let it out. He opened the folder. It wasn't a fancy business proposal. It was just ideas. Pictures of community centers. Plans for scholarships that covered instruments, not just tuition. You would be the artistic director, Vance continued, his voice gaining strength. Not a performer. A guide. You would listen. You would find the teachers, choose the instruments, shape the heart of the thing. You could make sure no kid with a gift ever has to choose between their music and… He trailed off, not wanting to say a sick loved one. But the words hung in the air. Leo had stopped folding. He was looking at the papers, but his eyes were far away. It would be yours, Vance said, his final, most important point. Not mine. My name would be on the checks, but only so people would pay attention. The vision, the soul of it. That would be yours. And your wife's. You could name it after her. We could call it, I don't know, the Melody Foundation. At the mention of his wife's name, Leo's composure cracked. Just a little. His chin trembled. He reached out and touched one of the sketches, a drawing of a small, sunny room with a piano in it. He would have loved a room like this, Leo whispered, more to himself than to Vance. Vance asked softly. Leo was silent for a long time. The dryer clicked off. My son, he said, the words barely audible. When my wife was sick, we had a little boy. He was 4 when she died. The music, my career, the travel. It was all just a world of sadness to him. When I quit, I thought I was doing the right thing. I got this job, steady hours. We could be normal. He wiped a hand over his face. But I was just a ghost, too. A quiet ghost. He grew up in that silence. He's a good man now. Practical. He's an engineer. But he never understood. He never knew who I was before. He just knew the quiet man who came home tired. We don't talk much. The revelation was a piece of the puzzle Vance hadn't even known was missing. The tragedy wasn't just a lost career or a lost love. It was a lost connection, a story a father never passed on. This, Vance said, pointing to the papers, could be a way to tell him. Not with words, with action. You could build a living thing, for other families, in her name. Maybe he would understand then. Leo looked up, and for the first time, Vance saw something besides sorrow or exhaustion in his eyes. He saw a flicker, a tiny, fragile spark of purpose. It wouldn't be about the past, Leo said slowly, as if testing the idea. It would be about what grows from it. Yes, Vance said, a surge of hope in his chest. Exactly. Leo picked up the sketch of the sunny room. He held it for a long moment. Then he nodded, just once. Okay, we can try. The next day, Vance called a press conference. This time, it was on his terms. He stood at a podium, with Leo standing a few steps behind him, not in a suit, but in a simple, clean button-down shirt. The cameras went wild. Vance laid out the plan for the Melody Foundation. He explained its purpose, not to create stars, but to provide the simple, vital gift of music. He announced a massive, personal donation to start it. And then, he did the most important thing. He stepped aside. None of this would exist without the man behind me, Vance said. He is not a viral sensation. He is not a contest winner. He is an artist who remembers why art matters. He is the heart of this foundation, and he is the one who will decide what it becomes. He has agreed to be our artistic director. His first act will be to ensure every penny is spent where it should be, on kids, on instruments, on keeping the music alive where it might otherwise die. Please direct your questions to him. The reporters were stunned. They expected a circus. They were being given a schoolhouse. Leo stepped to the podium. He looked nervous, but calm. The first shouted question was the one everyone wanted. Will you perform again? Will you record an album? Leo looked directly at the reporter. No, he said, his voice steady. My performance days are over. My job now is to make sure others get their first chance. This foundation, it's for my wife. It's so other families can have more music, more joy. That's the only statement I want to make. It wasn't what the media wanted, but it was so honest, so dignified, that they couldn't help but respect it. The story began to change, shifting from a billionaire's joke to a story of redemption and legacy. Late that night, in his apartment, Leo did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He picked up his phone and called his son. He didn't talk about the news. He didn't talk about the foundation. He just said, I was thinking about your mother today. I wondered if you had some time soon. Maybe I could tell you some stories about her, about the music, if you'd like to hear them. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then his son's voice, cautious but not cold, said, Yeah, Dad, I'd like that. Leo hung up the phone and sat in his quiet living room. For the first time in a very long time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like a space waiting to be filled, not with the roar of a crowd, but with the simple, hopeful notes of a beginner's piano lesson. Somewhere in a sunlit room that didn't exist yet, he had a job to do. A year passed. The buzzing frenzy of the viral video had faded, replaced by something quieter, something real. The story of the billionaire and the janitor hadn't ended. It had simply changed channels. It was no longer on the news ticker. It was in the sound of a hammer hitting a nail, in the scent of fresh paint, and in the hesitant, beautiful notes coming from behind a newly hung door. The old Starlight Theater was a landmark in a part of the city the gleaming towers had forgotten. For years, it had been a sad place, its marquee dark, its doors locked. Now, on a bright Saturday morning, it was pulsing with life. A new sign, simple and elegant, hung above the entrance. ***, the Melody Foundation, *** inside. The transformation was a kind of magic. The dusty velvet seats were gone, replaced by neat rows of chairs and open floor space. The stage remained, but it was no longer the only focus. The walls were lined with small, soundproofed practice rooms. The air hummed with the sounds of construction finalizing details, a drill whining, someone testing the light in the main hall. In the middle of the main floor, Leo stood with a clipboard. He wore comfortable pants and a collared shirt, a lanyard with a building plan around his neck. He looked older than he had a year ago, but in a different way. The deep exhaustion was gone. The lines on his face were still there, but they looked more like marks from smiling and squinting in thought, not just from sorrow. He was pointing out where the last of the upright pianos should go when a familiar voice called out, "They're saying the acoustics in room 3 are even better than the main hall." The acoustician is practically crying. Vance Sterling walked over, rolling up the sleeves of a simple Henley shirt. There was dust on his jeans. For the past 6 months, he had been a constant, unexpected presence on the site, not giving orders from a distance, but showing up on weekends, asking questions, and sometimes just moving boxes. He'd learned the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver. It had been a humbling experience, in the best way. Leo smiled, a genuine, easy smile. Room 3 is for the beginners. The acoustics soften the wrong notes, makes them less afraid to try. See, Vance said, shaking his head. That's the thinking I'd never have. I'd want the big, impressive sound. You think about the fear. I remember the fear, Leo said softly. They walked through the space together. It wasn't a sterile institution. It felt warm, welcoming. There were couches in the lobby where parents could wait. The walls were painted a soft, warm yellow. On one long wall, there was a simple, beautiful mural. It wasn't of famous composers, but of hands. All kinds of hands, young, old, smooth, wrinkled, reaching toward musical notes that floated like leaves on a breeze. In the corner, in small, elegant script, it read, * for Elena, who heard the music in everyone. * The first group arrives on Monday, Leo said, a note of nervous excitement in his voice. The after-school program. 20 kids. Most have never touched an instrument. And you're ready? Vance asked. We have the instruments. We have the teachers who understand the mission. We're ready. They ended up in the main hall, on the edge of the stage. The beautiful concert grant from Vance's penthouse was now here, center stage, looking more at home than it ever had in the sterile ballroom. Leo looked at it, his expression complex. It was no longer a symbol of a cruel joke, but a tool, a gift to be shared. I want to show you something, Vance said. He led Leo to the side of the stage, to a simple door marked Director. Inside was a small, sunlit office. It had a desk, shelves for music, and in the corner, a small, beautiful upright piano. On the desk was a single framed photograph of a woman with a kind, laughing face. Your office, Vance said. Leo was touched. It's too much. It's exactly enough, Vance corrected him. He leaned against the doorframe. You know, I spent my whole life collecting things. Companies, properties, objects. I thought that was building a legacy. It's just inventory. This, he said, gesturing to the walls beyond. This is the first real thing I've ever built. Leo understood. He put a hand on the smooth wood of the little piano. You built the house. I'll just try to fill it with the right sounds. The opening day of the foundation was not a black tie gala. There was no champagne. Instead, the air smelled of cookies and lemonade. The sounds were the squeaks of sneakers on polished floors and the chatter of nervous, excited children being led by their parents. Leo stood at the entrance, greeting everyone. He shook small hands, knelt down to talk to wide-eyed kids. He was no longer the janitor maestro to them. He was just Mr. Leo, the nice man who ran the music place Vance watched from a corner. A cup of lemonade in his hand, he saw a little girl, no more than 7, break away from her mother and run straight to one of the open practice rooms, where a small keyboard was set up. She didn't play a song. She just pressed one key, over and over, listening to the sound, a look of pure wonder on her face. That single, repeated note was, to Vance, more beautiful than any symphony. The formal part of the day was simple. Everyone gathered in the main hall. Vance said a few short words. He thanked the community, the builders, the teachers. Then he said, "This place has one director, and he has something to share with you." Leo walked onto the stage. He looked out at the faces, the children fidgeting, the parents hopeful, the teachers eager. His eyes found his son, standing near the back. He had come. They had been talking, slowly, carefully, over the past months. The bridge was being built, note by note. "Music isn't about being perfect," Leo began, his voice filling the room without a microphone. "It's about being brave. It's about finding a way to say something when you don't have the words. In this room, there is no such thing as a wrong note. There is only trying. There is only the sound you make today, which will be different from the sound you make tomorrow." He walked to the grand piano and sat down. A hush fell, but it was a different hush from the one in the penthouse. This was not a crowd waiting for a spectacle. It was a community, waiting for a blessing. "This is for everyone who thinks it's too late to start," Leo said. "And for everyone who is just beginning." He didn't play Rachmaninoff. He played something simpler, a gentle, flowing piece by Chopin. It was full of tenderness and light. It was not a storm of grief, but a sunrise of hope. He played it for the children, to show them beauty. He played it for the parents, to promise them something good for their kids. He played it for his wife, whose memory now lived in these walls. And he played it for himself, a man who had finally found a way to play again without the pain swallowing him whole. As the last note faded, there was a moment of pure, quiet peace. Then, the little girl who had been hitting the single key clapped, a loud, happy slap of sound, and everyone joined in after. As people explored the rooms and kids were trying out drums and violins, Leo found his son by the mural wall. "She would have loved this, Dad," his son said, his voice a little thick. "I think so too," Leo replied. His son looked at him, really looked at him. "I never knew. I never understood what you gave up. I just saw you giving up. I didn't know how to show you," Leo said. "I'm sorry, don't be," his son said. He pointed to a young boy struggling to hold a cello, a teacher patiently adjusting his fingers. "You're showing me now, later," as the sun began to set, painting the warm yellow walls orange. The building emptied. Leo and Vance were the last ones there, locking up. They stood on the front steps, looking at the newly lit marquee that simply said, **welcome. Make music. So, Vance said, taking a deep breath of the evening air. "We did it. We started," Leo corrected him. "The work starts Monday," Vance nodded, looking satisfied. "The best kind of work." He offered his hand. Partner Leo took it. The handshake was firm. It was not between a billionaire and a janitor. It was between two men who had, against all odds, built something real together. "Partner," Vance drove off, and Leo stood for a moment longer on the steps. From inside, through the closed doors, he couldn't hear any music. It was quiet, but for the first time in 2 decades, the quiet didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an intake of breath. It felt like the space between notes, full of potential, waiting for the next phrase to begin. He turned, unlocked the door, and went back inside, home, to prepare for tomorrow.